to the first in a series of journeys to tell something about the historic landscape of Abbey parish in the county of Cumbria. Perhaps we're also memorialising parts of this landscape through telling stories about lines, marks and place names left upon it by many anonymous generations. What follows is not a quick dash through the centuries. It's deliberately detailed and slow-paced. We hope it will help you make your own slow and detailed engagement with a many-layered landscape. This first screen is to help you get a sense of where Abbey is. Marked by a yellow pin, we see it in the context of northern England. I'll give you a moment or two to get your bearings before we move a little closer. We'll move now that little bit closer. We're about 5 miles south of Abbey in Westmoreland. In August 2016, the parish of Abbey was incorporated into the Yorkshire Dales National Park as part of the Westmoreland Dales. Today we're going to fly over part of the parish to look at land that was given by local landowners in the 12th and 13th centuries to the North Yorkshire Abbey of Byland, and which became a grange of that abbey. If you'd like to know more about the history of Byland, check out the links on the Abbey Parish webpage where this video can be found. Research of landscape we're looking at is just beginning, so the story we will tell will have some gaps and some guesswork. Hopefully not too many and not too much. On this screen, the outer line coloured red is the boundary of Abbey parish, and within it, also coloured red, are the boundaries of 3 medieval manors: Abbey Winderwath, Abbey Coatsford and Abbey Little or Little Abbey, although we don't yet know exactly when these 3 manors acquired separate identities. The names of the 3 manors are in white font. To the west, or at the upper left of your screen, around and to the left of Gaythorne Hall, you can see a limb of land that was once part of Abbey Winderwath Manor before becoming part of a new manor of Gaythorne in the 13th century. It was part of the ancient ecclesiastical parish of Abbey until 1935, when it was incorporated in the neighbouring parish of Crosby Ravensworth. Also shown are Abbey's parish church, St. Peter's at top centre, a small number of farmsteads in blue font, and one walled structure, Pickering Close. The name is in yellow at lower left, and this is to help those who do have some knowledge of the area to get more precise bearings. Grants of land given to support religious communities, the kind of thing we're looking at in this video, were an important feature of the central medieval period. Such grants were made primarily for the purpose of personal and family salvation, and that's captured in the formulaic opening words of one Abbey land charter of the period, and I quote, "Know ye that I have given and granted this land for the safety of my soul and the souls of all my ancestors." But human concerns were not confined to the care of the soul. Granting land to a capable farming order like the Cistercian monks of Byland was also a way for feudal landowners to ensure that areas of land, sometimes quite marginal lands, were properly developed, and that leading-edge farming methods from which other tenants of the lord of the manor could learn were brought into the locality. We're going to concentrate now on the lands given to Byland Abbey. These lands are about 1.5 miles and roughly south of the village of Great Abbey. As you can see, we're quite close to the hamlet of Little Abbey. Here, in 5 adjacent blocks of colour, we see the estimated extent of the grange. It consisted, in large part, of land granted to Byland through 2 charters of the 12th and 13th centuries. The first, involving land coloured pale reddish-brown, took place around 1160 to 1170. The second, land coloured yellow-green, probably slightly later in the 12th century or early in the 13th. Descriptions of the boundaries of this land, given in the charters, enable us to give a fairly accurate picture of its extent. I've also included land, 3 blocks coloured blue here, bottom left, top right and bottom right, closer to Little Abbey, this one. All of this blue land was also described as tithe-free in the mid-19th century. More on that later. And it was probably enclosed from the open fell at later unknown dates, but possibly during the time that there was still an active grange of Byland here. The first charter, dating from around 1160 to 1170, provided nearly 400 statute acres, or just over 161 hectares. The second, land coloured yellow-green, dated a little later, granted land extending to 135 statute acres, or a little more than 54 hectares. The most easterly of the 3 enclosures coloured blue, which took in land from the western side of Abbey Mask, is an area of 57 statute acres, almost exactly 23 hectares. This second intake from the fell, from the northwestern edge of Little Abbey Common, is 103 statute acres, or 42 hectares in extent. This third, smallest parcel of blue land is about 13 acres, or 5 hectares. In total, these 5 blocks amount to almost 600 statute acres, 240 hectares or thereabouts. This makes it a mid-sized grange in the context of Cistercian medieval granges. We don't know if at least part or even all of the landscape which the Abbey obtained through grants was already being farmed. Some archaeological features in the landscape suggest this was probably the case. The land extends over 2 different manors, Abbey Coatsford to the north in white font at the top of the screen, and Little Abbey to the south, again in white font at the bottom of the screen. But, as we noted a moment ago, we don't really know the precise relationship of these manors to each other at the time of the gift of land. It's possible that Abbey was still a single manor at this date. Pots and water houses, which you can see here, are the sites of 2 farmsteads, the first of these now derelict. One outcome of granting land to Byland was that it connected this part of the Abbey landscape not only to a national network of religious houses, but also to a spine of medieval European connections built around the wool trade. This spine ran all the way from industrial-scale sheep farming in northern England, through the Cistercian mother houses, to Flanders, to Paris, and on to northern Italy. Connection to this international network also meant that the acres we're looking at were unlike lands surrounding them in one very important way. Instead of being locked into a system of subsistence farming or production for long-established local markets, they were part of an early form of commercial stock rearing for distant markets. In an attempt to estimate the location and extent of this Byland estate, 2 main pieces of evidence have been used. These were combined with what we know from other sources about some local landscape features. The first piece of evidence, and this is where we return to tithes, is the names and locations of those fields which were free of tithes in the 19th century. That information is set down in Abbey Parish tithe documents drawn up in the 1840s. Exemption from tithes is an indication that the lands making up these fields were once part of a Cistercian estate, And Byland, of course, was a Cistercian foundation. From 1221, Cistercian lands were tithe-free when they were in the direct occupation of a monastery, that is, when they were not leased or farmed to tenants. Freedom from tithes continued to be given to lay owners who acquired Cistercian estates after the dissolution of the monasteries. The second piece of evidence is a description of the location of the land given to Byland as set out in the two charters already mentioned. The translations of the charters used are those published in the work of historians Frederick Wragg, John Curwen and Janet Burton. We're going to begin our journey at what is the northwestern edge of what I believe to have been the Byland estate, at a point marked by a green arrow and star just above the centre screen. The boundary description of land given in that first charter of 1160 to 1170 begins with the words you can see in the text box, as Maisongill goes down from the Skers. The first place name, Maisongill, almost certainly refers to an area which includes a field still known as Maisongill. That name, in yellow, is centre screen, below the arrow. Don't confuse it with a farmstead to the west, to the left, its label written in blue, which now uses the same name. The first part of this name, maison, is nothing to do with the French word for house, and is probably derived from an Old English word, gemere, which means boundary. We cannot be sure when and why Maisongill came to be known by that name. It seems unlikely that it's connected with it being on the boundary of the monastic estate, and it was probably in use from an earlier date. It's on or close to a boundary which at some point in time came to separate different Abbey manors. That red line running through Maisongill marks what, at an unknown date, became the boundary between the manors of Abbey Windewath on the left and Little Abbey on the right. Of course, Maisongill may have been part of a much more ancient boundary line, perhaps reused, so to speak, as a manor boundary at the time of the division of Abbey Manor. We'll move a little way northeast to follow on the ground the next words of the charter. You can see those next words here, and from the lower head of that gill, and this is still referring to Maisongill, of course, to the thorn tree standing on the How of Stones, which is on the lower side of Lathgrim, and then in a straight line across to Little Lingwall. How might these words transfer to the Google Earth image we're looking at? The How of Stones may have been at or close to the lower end of a relict wall which runs west to east, upslope. The approximate line of that wall is marked as a yellow line here at the top of the screen. At this period, the words How of Stones were often used to describe surviving Bronze Age burial cairns, dating from a much earlier period, of course. All that can be seen today at the possible position of the How of Stones is a rough scatter of stones on the ground, immediately to the right of the dry stone wall, marked in the photograph by a ranging pole, although there is some suggestion of a circular structure passing beneath the wall. The Old Norse word, spelled H-A-U-G-R, but pronounced something like Hakka, from which how derives, can simply mean a hill, a natural height, a heap, or any artificial mound, as well as a burial mound. So the how here may have been a clearance cairn of stones, removed from land in prehistoric times, to make it easier to cultivate or better for grazing. Those cleared stones have probably, over the centuries since, been incorporated into generations of walls, leaving only a small scatter like the one here. Of course, we can't be certain that this was the How of Stones, but scant, as I've already mentioned, remnants of a wall do run up the slope from here towards the left end of the trees on the skyline, in a straight line across to Little Lingwall, as the words of the charter have it. Remember that name, Little Lingwall. The remnants of that wall may be what remains of part of the boundary of the lands of the Grange. And here is the line of that relict wall, marked approximately by that yellow line, which runs up the slope from the How of Stones towards Little Lingwall. Those stones in what may have been a clearance cairn may have been gathered up by people living very close by, because the name Little Lingwall may be one that was given to a small so-called Romano-British settlement dating perhaps from around 100 BC to 400 AD. This name, Lingwall, probably derives from ling, that's L-Y-N-G, an Old Norse word for heather, combined with the Old English wall, embankment or wall. So the name Lingwall probably means an embankment or wall, and that, of course, may have been the stony remains of the Romano-British settlement, an embankment or wall which is overgrown with heather. It's possible that Little Lingwall, within and to the right of the trees at the top of the photograph, acquired its diminutive prefix to distinguish it from another nearby larger Romano-British site, perhaps once known as Great Lingwall. The boundary running across to Little Lingwall, in the words of the charter, passes over land which bore the name Leithgrim in that charter. In the 16th century, we find this area referred to as Lagrum. There it is in white typescript, top centre. Lagrum is a local field name or land name which has been lost, in the sense that it has not been used for a very long time. Track marker. This may have simply referred to a large rock or stone used to mark what may have been an ancient way which runs over this ground. Today there is still a bridle way that links the village of Great Abbey to the farms of Grange Hall, Aspey Grange, Burtree, and eventually the settlement of Little Aspey. Over time, as you can see from the text box, the minor place name Leithgrim, found in other parts of the north, tended to change to names like Legrums or Legrum. We find our field name, written as Lagrum, in a late 16th century document about a local land dispute. So, we can be fairly confident about restoring the name Leithgrim, or as we have it here in a later form of Lagrum, to its place in the landscape. Indeed, we may go a little further and speculate about a feature that may have been the large rock or stone to which the name track marker was given. At the top of the slope of Lagrum, there are these earth-fast irregular blocks of limestone, which appear to have been deliberately tipped onto their edges. They are close to the surviving bridleway as it makes its way towards Grange Hall and then, as we said, on to Little Aspey. But they're on the line of another discernible old trackway that in this photograph goes away down the slope between the stones on the right and those in the centre. Could this combination of stones have been the track marker, the Leithgrim, that gave this land its name? We're now going to make a very short flight to the north and slightly east. We've come here to look at a field called Beecham. There it is at centre right. Beecham wasn't part of the larger land grant made during the period 1160 to 1170, but it does feature, under the name Beauchamp, in another much smaller grant to Byland, set out in an undated document, but which is probably from the later 1260s. That smaller grant was made by a Roger Monting, or Muting of Askerby, to the abbots and monks of Byland. Here is how the land is described. Byland was an older name for Byland. The gift made at this date was, and you can see on the screen the translated words of the charter, 5 acres of arable land in a furlong called Beauchamp, between the land of William le Inglis and of Thomas Buath, quit claiming all charges that the abbot and monks have been overstocking the pastures. It looks as if this was part of the conclusion of a dispute between Monting and Byland, whereby Monting withdrew his allegations about overstocking pastures. Perhaps he made the gift by way of redress to Byland for what may have been an unfounded claim. The pastures referred to are common grazing which Byland would have had access to through holding land within the medieval manor. Access which would have been shared with other tenants like the complainant Roger Monting. This charter document gives insight to tensions that may sometimes have existed between monastic grangers and other local farmers. Monting wasn't the only local man who became embroiled during this period in dispute with Byland about his rights of pasture. The description of Beauchamp or Beecham in this document as a furlong, the clear reference to arable land, and the description of the 5 acres being located between the lands of others, all point to Beecham being a part, or a furlong as they were sometimes called, of open common or town fields of the manor. These open town fields would have been divided into a series of small strip holdings held by tenants of the lord of the manor. The size of this parcel of land, 5 acres, may also point to a number of strip holdings being grouped together. 5 Westmoreland customary acres at this period would have been equivalent to around 8.5 statute acres. Some individual strip holdings within a town field could be much smaller, as small as half an acre. Here I've added some other mid-19th century tithe map field names close by. To judge from the element flat or flats in their names, they also appear to have been part of cultivated common fields. You can see these field names in yellow at the centre and at lower left. The names are derived from an Old Norse word, flot, F-L-O-T, but pronounced flot, meaning a level area of ground. This word was adopted into Middle English as flat, and eventually acquired the specific sense of being a division of a large open arable field. Incidentally, we can see here that larger Romano-British site, now known as Holborn Hill, and which we mentioned a few minutes ago as perhaps being called in earlier times Great Lingwall. It's almost in the centre of the screen, its name in blue. This screenshot of a LiDAR image of part of Beecham, that's the end of the area of LiDAR coverage to the right of the screen, not the edge of the world, appears to show evidence of field banks and ridge and furrow within the field. These may be linked to a number of periods of cultivation, of ploughing. The origin of the field's name is not known, although a suggestion has been made that it comes from the family name Beauchamp. A family of that name was closely associated with the de Morvilles in Appleby in the 12th century, at a time when the de Morvilles would have had overall control of the manor here in Abbey. Although curiously, the meaning of Beauchamp, beautiful field, would have been very close to that of Byland, the old name for Byland, if you remember, from a few moments ago. So perhaps there is some other connection here, which remains to be teased out. Now, let's resume our flight eastwards along the boundaries of Byland Abbey land. After the boundary leaves Little Lingwall, there it is at top left of the screen, the words of the charter tell us that it went eastward to the How of Stones upon Widcombe Fell. We can be confident that the charter's words How of Stones, they're at the beginning of the last line in the textbook, probably refer on this occasion to an identified Bronze Age cairn, now known as Grange Hall Round Cairn. And this site is marked just above the centre of the screen, below the text box. Today you can still see what remains of a mutilated and disturbed round cairn, close to a fork in a narrow access track, which leads from the Abbey Mask Road to Abbey Grange and to Grange Hall. The words of the Charter also imply that an expanse of land here may once have been known as Widconfell. I've marked this name close to the Grange boundary we're trying to trace, but it probably applied to a wide area and probably included land on which a farmstead called Fell Head, to the right of the screen, stands today. As you can read in the text box, Widcombe, another lost or long disused landscape name, may be derived from the Old Norse personal name Vidkonna. So this land may once have been Vidkonna's Fell, perhaps another example of names given to this landscape during Scandinavian settlement of parts of the Upper Eden Valley in the 10th century. So we can now return this name to an expanse of land to which it may have first been given over 1,000 years ago. Before we move further on around the boundary, let's go a little south of Widcombe Fell to the two present-day farmsteads that lie here. Abbey Grange and Grange Hall have their names, of course, because the land we're travelling over was, as we've been discussing, a grange or an outlying farm at Byland Abbey. A monastic grange was usually worked by lay brothers, generally thought of as the labour force of a religious order, together with paid farm labourers. It would probably have had stock rearing and arable functions. Many Cistercian granges, and Byland, remember, was a Cistercian house, specialised in wool production. Although this grange was some distance from Byland, it was one of several holdings which the Abbey had in the area. Others were at Warcop and Blaytarn. But as early as the middle of the 13th century, the expanding European market that had stimulated large-scale agricultural organisation began to show signs of contraction. By the 14th century, even before the Black Death decimated the population, England's rural economy was in decline. As a consequence, religious houses began to make an urgent reappraisal of their assets. The management of upland granges, far from lowland monasteries, as this grange was part of this reappraisal. In addition, the earlier period of rural prosperity had begun to undermine recruitment into the monastic orders, including the recruitment of lay brothers. Consequently, by the 14th century, many monastic granges were leased to lay tenants. The Black Death in 1349 diminished numbers still further. Deprived of their principal workforce, monks reorganised their economy, leasing even more land to tenants. The whole of Byland's grange lands in Abbey appear to have been leased by the late 15th century, with part, it appears, leased at an even earlier date, perhaps in the troubled 14th century. It may be significant that the earliest parts of the structure of Grange Hall are dated to the 14th century. This may mark a period of rebuilding, when lands began to move from direct monastic management to secular tenancy. The Grange buildings would have been designed in the first instance for lay brethren, and probably unsuited to the new occupants, and therefore requiring reconfiguration. Although it was also a period of Scottish incursions, of course, which would have demanded improved defensive structures anyway. One Westmoreland historian, Frederick Wragg, wrote in 1909 about a Lowther document of 1477 that tells of this transition to secular tenancy. In that year the Abbot of Byland leased Abbey Grange, except that part which Edmund Scaife already held, implying that earlier occasion of leasing, to Thomas Scaife, brother of Edmund, for 10 years. 17th century documents in the Cumbria archives show that the Scaife family continued to hold the property as tenants at that much later 17th century date, long after the dissolution, when the property had passed into the possession of the Bellingham family. Stephen Moorhouse, a landscape historian working mainly in the West Riding of Yorkshire, commented about these 2 Grange farmsteads, and I'll read from notes of my conversation with him. It's interesting, he said, that there are 2 adjoining Grange farms at Abbey, because Grange management often required 2 quite separate units of flock management, one for the wethers and one for the ewes and lambs. Wethers, castrated male sheep, were the primary source of wool. Stephen's observations about flock management arrangements may well be the explanation for the existence of 2 Grange farms or units within a single Grange, but alternatively, the explanation may lie in the possibility that one part of this Byland estate was devoted to cattle rearing and the other to sheep. I say this because a number of landscape features south and west of the 2 present-day Grange farmsteads have names associated with cattle: Oxenmoor, Cowdale Slack, Cowman Scar, whereas, as we'll see in a moment, landscape to the north and east contains field names which may suggest an association with sheep. As an immediate aside about another field name, it's worth noting one you can see here, Big Garth, in yellow font to the right of Abbey Grange. The word big in this case does not refer to the size of the enclosure. In medieval times the word great would have been used to denote large size, not big. Rather, as you can see in the text box, the name tells of the crop once grown in this field. Remember, we mentioned a few moments ago that Granges had arable as well as stock rearing functions, and this field name could date from the period of monastic occupation. It derives from the Old Norse word big, B-Y-G-G, meaning barley. Depending on the type of barley grown, it would have been used either for malting, for brewing, or for a coarse bread flour. This LiDAR image of Big Garth shows rig and furrow, evidence of ploughing, probably with an oxen team given the characteristic curve in the line of the furrows, at some time in the past. Perhaps there's also evidence of headlands here, where the ploughs would have been turned, with soil falling from the ploughshares to build up over the years. Let's continue eastwards. There's some uncertainty about the next section of the boundary, running to the right of Grange Hall round Cairn. We've definitely arrived at some of those gaps and guesswork I mentioned right at the beginning. The reasons are at least fourfold. First, I'm not certain about the exact meaning of the words used to describe every landscape detail of the boundaries of land in the Charter of 1160 to 1170. That, remember, is the area coloured reddish-brown. Second, some of the land here in fields described as being exempt from tithes in the middle of the 19th century may have been land given to Byland in a second charter of the later 12th or early 13th century. They're coloured yellow-green here, and more about them in a moment. Third, some land coloured blue may have been, as I mentioned earlier, part of enclosure from the open fell at some later point or points in the life of the Grange, or even after the land passed into first lay tenancy and then lay ownership. Fourth, of course, there could have been some completely undocumented adjustments of boundaries made before the dissolution. The earlier charter, and its translated words are here in the text box, states that from the How of stones upon Widcombe Fell, that's the identified Bronze Age burial cairn we looked at a few moments ago, the boundary of the land given to the Abbey went to another How, thence to a third. These words imply that there was once a series of Bronze Age burial cairns on this fell, running beyond and east of Grange Hall Round Cairn. That's to the right of the cairn, of course, as we're looking at it from here. Burial cairns were often constructed in groups, and there are 3 close together elsewhere in the parish on Gaythorne Plain. These other 2 hows mentioned in the charter could, of course, as we noted earlier about the various meanings of that Old Norse root word, have been natural features or clearance cairns. But what do we find on the ground if we walk here today? Close to the eastern side of the Grange Hill Round Cairn is some evidence of what may be vestiges of a stone and earth bank running eastwards from the cairn towards a present-day dry stone wall. Although it must also be acknowledged that what we're looking at here could be a natural feature. Nonetheless, I have drawn an assumed boundary of the land granted in the earlier charter along the line of this feature. You can follow that line from the site of the Grange Hall Round Cairn, there at top centre left, along the boundary between the brown and the pale green shading. If we walk the ground here, we also find, bearing in mind the charter's words about hows or burial cairns, features which could be all that remain of those cairns. Here is the first of them, even more mutilated and disturbed than Grange Hall Round Cairn and considerably smaller. There are loose stones around an area approximately 8 metres in diameter. The much greater quantity of stones used in its original construction may well have been recycled over the years to construct the dry stone walls close by. Some distance away is the location of a possible third how that the charter mentions. It's not a clear picture on the ground. Are the lumps and bumps of this area the remains of a cairn? Once again, it's about 8 metres in diameter. The site is clearly visible from what I think might be the second how, and the next feature that the charter mentions, the ditch, or what I believe to be the ditch, more on that in a moment, is also visible from this point. It may be of significance that there's also a clear line of sight between this possible group of cairns and that group of burial cairns on Gaythorne Plain that I mentioned a few moments ago, some 2.5 miles distant. Some archaeologists argue that intervisibility may have been an important characteristic in the choice of prehistoric monument and burial locations. There is no sign of any boundary running between these 2 possible house sites that the charter refers to. But let's turn to look at the dry stone wall that runs a few yards east of the 2 features that I think may have been burial cairns. In a number of places in this wall we find these substantial stones, these orthostats. Their positions are marked by ranging poles at the foot of the wall in this photograph, which may have been boundary marker stones put in place by those surveying the boundaries for the Grange lands, or surviving elements of an even earlier wall. Whatever they were, they'd been incorporated into the footings of more recent walls. They begin to appear in the wall at a point that is in line with what I've speculated to be the site of the second how. If this was the position of the third how, it's marked on the screen here, then from here the boundary of the first tranche of Byland land went, if you recall, onto the ditch. Where might that be? To help us find the possible location of the ditch, we're looking now at a screenshot of a section of the first edition of the 6-inch Ordnance Survey map. There's our approximate charter land boundary line, marked by a green arrow on the right, pointing at the wall with the orthostats in the footings. It's running towards the line of an old manorial boundary, indicated by 3 red arrows. This was the boundary between the manor of Little Abbey, below the line, and Abbey Coatsford, above it. There is some evidence of a bank traceable along parts of this boundary line, but at the time when the boundaries of the Abbey's lands were laid out, what already was, or what eventually became, the manor boundary may well have been marked by a bank and a ditch. Perhaps, as we've already speculated about other features, this was yet another ancient boundary, later repurposed as a manorial boundary. So it's possible that this was the position of the ditch that the charter refers to. Note Crosby House, marked here on the Ordnance Survey map, just beyond the red arrow furthest to the right. From its depiction on the map, Crosby House seems to have been a barn with a porch, a field house, an agricultural building, rather than a dwelling house. Let's go back to look at this location on Google Earth. Crosby House, now shown on this Google Earth image, blue font, centre left, is long demolished. The red line, remember, marks the manor boundary we've just looked at in conjunction with the extract from the Ordnance Survey map. It's probable that the first element of the minor place name Crosby is derived from the Old Norse or the Old English word for cross. The second is an Old Norse word, by, but pronounced more like bew, here probably meaning barn. This may indicate that it was the site of a cross of the kind sometimes erected where roads entered monastic lands. A track, still marked on OS maps as a bridle way, ran from here to what is the present-day road from Great Abbey to Solby, meeting that road close to the farmstead of Upper Wygill Head. To help you get your bearings, there's that road pointed to by a red arrow at the top right of the screen. This bridle way may once have been the principal approach road to the Byland Grange site, with the cross located where that road entered lands granted to Byland in the first of the charters I've been talking about. That's the land coloured reddish-brown. Let's return to those rather precise words of the charter, stating that the boundary of the land it's describing goes 8 perches beyond the ditch eastwards. If we assume a point where that curving boundary, which we followed from the second and third house, crosses the ditch, the red boundary line here, then goes 8 perches, or roughly 45 yards, eastwards, it brings us close to the beginning of the present-day long, sinuous wall of a field called High Pasture. You can see the field name at the bottom centre of the screen, with that sinuous boundary wall curving above the name. Although this boundary doesn't follow a direct line southwards unto the tarn, in the words of the charter, the association between curving wall lines and more ancient boundaries leads me to think that this may have been the line of the boundary, or close to it, of the granted lands. This wall of High Pasture, near to the site of Crosby House, doesn't have the same number of large stones placed on their edges and incorporated into its structure as the wall near the house that we looked at earlier. But it does have some substantial stones in its footings, as you can see here, which may indicate that the line of the wall, if not all of its present structure, dates from the time when the Grange was established here, and that this was part of its boundary. In a few moments we'll follow the line of this wall on its journey unto the tarn. But before we do that, let's look more closely at land which lies on the other side of this wall. It's an area that I believe features in a later charter. Here, within this green block, you can see are a series of fields with the element far in their names. These fields may have been formed over the years from what began as a single large far field. This name, Farfield, was the subject of speculation by the Reverend Canon Thornley, writing in 1899 about field names of Kirkoswald in the former county of Cumberland. You can see Canon Thornley's words in the text box. The striking absence of allusion to sheep in the field names raises a suspicion that some of the far lands, so often mentioned as field names he means, may be grazing grounds of the far, that's with a double R, Norse for sheep. Some of these far lands, Thornley says, are by no means far, that's with a single R, from the farmstead, and are without the companion near field. Thornley's last point about the absence of a near field can also be made about Aspey's far fields. Here too, as Thornley puts it, the far fields are without the companion near field. Their only companion, and rather oddly it could be argued, is a near far field. That field name is there, top centre, close to the text box, which may suggest that the second element in that name had little to do with distance. Thornley's speculation that the name of Farfield may indicate an association with sheep should be looked at together with this extract from a second piece of documentary evidence. It's the translation of a late 12th or early 13th century grant of land made to Byland for a specific purpose. And this extract is from the charter that granted this land we're looking down on, and which historian Janet Burton drew attention to in a book published in 2004. Unfortunately, as Janet points out, the name of the donor is missing from the original folio in the Byland records. The charter refers, as you can see, to land given to Byland to fence and enclose as the monks please. This grant is made for the salvation of the soul of the donor and of all his or her ancestors and heirs. It gives, in the last 4 lines of text here, permission to make a sheepfold above Stannerstones for 300 sheep by the long 100. A long 100, as you can read here within the square brackets at the end, actually numbered 120. And there, just to the east, lower right of the screen, are 2 fields, Stannerstones and Stannerstones Mire. So the boundary of Farfield is indeed above Stannerstones, as the words of the charter describe the location of the sheepfold. Let's continue to look at the translated words of this charter. What may be in doubt is whether the word translated as sheepfold refers to a single enclosure or building, or to a whole sheep farming operation. I haven't seen the original charter, but the Latin word used was almost certainly Beccaria, which meant sheep farm, and such a larger operation is implied, of course, by those opening words, the first line in the text box, which refer to land that the monks are to fence and enclose as they please. At its peak, Byland Abbey had an estimated total flock of 7,000 sheep. The numbers of sheep kept at Abbey are not known, but flock figures for granges of other religious orders in the northwest of England ranged from 200 to 360. That flock of 300 by the long 100 is at precisely the upper end of this range. The extent of land estimated to feature in this later charter is 135 acres or so, just under 55 hectares. The area you see, coloured yellow-green. Perhaps, according to Tim Cleasby, whose family farmed at Grange Hall for nearly 200 years, not so far off the acreage required for 360 sheep with the smaller body size they would have had in the 12th or 13th century. Let's go back to pick up the boundary of that land shaded brown, the subject of the earlier Byland Charter. We'll follow what I said I was assuming was a sinuous line of the boundary of this land, which is the present-day northeastern wall of high pasture, centre of the screen. It goes past the present-day farmstead of Burtree and continues south. As it climbs up the slope from its starting point, 8 perches beyond the ditch eastward, if you remember the words of the charter, and that starting point is marked here with a red arrow, and then reaches to where a second field boundary joins it on the northern side, that's marked here with a blue arrow, the line of the wall passes over something. This LiDAR image of the area, and once again we're at the limits of LiDAR coverage of this landscape, as we were earlier when we were at Beecham, shows that what the wall passes over, or cuts, is the northern tip of what appears to be a late prehistoric settlement or arrangement for stock management. My initial thought was that this feature may raise doubts as to whether this line we're following could actually have been a medieval boundary. However, my understanding is that the view of landscape archaeologists is that this prehistoric settlement would obviously have long gone out of use and would have been disregarded by those laying out the boundaries of the Abbey's lands. The description of the next part of boundary in the Charter has been interpreted by some to cover a great distance in very few words. The terse instruction, you can see it in the text box, is, "and so going southward unto the Tarn." In the past, scholars of Cumbrian history, such as Ragg and Curwen, have concluded that the tarn referred to is Sunbiggin Tarn. However, that is over 3 kilometres, nearly 2 miles away. And we also have that long stretch of boundary without any reference in the Charter to landscape features to help mark the precise route of it along the whole of its length. On the face of it, this seems most unusual. First, because there is normally a line of sight between each landscape feature mentioned in a charter. Secondly, if the boundary did take this route, it was across open fell that has never been enclosed. It seems so unusual that my view is that the tarn the charter is referring to was a much smaller area of water called Ascot Dub. It's there at the bottom left centre. Its description as the tarn may suggest it is much more immediately local, an Aspy tarn, if you will. This dub is just west of a track that leads to the farmstead of Burtree. Now, for most of the year, presumably because of changes in watercourses or drainage, or a combination of the two, it's merely a marked depression in the landscape. I've taken extreme license, I think, in colouring it blue. In reality, it is far from blue, more of a bleached brown here. I'll open a text box to show something about how this name, Ascot Dub, probably came into being. It's probably a bit easier to follow if you've got some words in front of you. As you can see, the first element of its name, Ascot, probably derives from the name Assagata, or the Aspey Road, the road that goes into the hamlet of Little Aspey. That's marked bottom right, only a short distance away. Assa is a shortened form of Ascaby, an older form of Aspey. The gate or gata part derives, you can see, from the Old Norse word gata, meaning a road or street. Dub is now a dialect word for a usually small, rushy or sievey expanse of water, probably derived from the Old English word dub, with 2 B's, meaning pool. Now that we've fixed our tarn in the landscape, before we go on, let's go just a little way east from Ascot Dub to look at some fields that have an intriguing name. Just southeast of the present-day farmstead of Bertree, these fields, coloured pale purple here, contain the element oinum in their names. I've marked up some of them. The doyen of historians of northwest England, Angus Winchester, tells us, and I quote, "Where a block of fields all bear variants of a common name, as is the case here with our group of oinums, and indeed it was also the case with the far fields we looked at a few moments ago, the implication," Angus continues, "is that they represent subdivisions of what was a larger unit. Very often, such block names preserve the memory of land farmed communally that has later been enclosed." As you can see, this element oinum in the field names is derived from yet another Old Norse word, afnum, which means land newly taken in. We find that root surviving in a number of versions of this field name found in Yorkshire and Cumbria. Enum, Ainum, Yanums, and so on. You can read them in this text box. These lands were probably an extension of the common arable, the manorial town fields. Land newly taken in, for cultivation that is, by the manor of Little Abbey. And perhaps this was at a time of population growth, somewhere between, say, the 12th and early 14th centuries. The national population is thought to have doubled or even tripled during this period. Perhaps there was some kind of agricultural structure on the present-day Bertree site, that's just above the centre of the screen in blue font, as long ago as the time of the Byland Grange. The land immediately south of the farmstead, coloured blue here, was recorded as exempt from tithes in the 19th century, so it may once have been part of the Abbey's medieval landholding. But, as I've already mentioned, my understanding is that those people who purchased or were given Cistercian lands after the dissolution of the monasteries retained the same exemption from tithes that the Cistercians had enjoyed. And I suppose it's possible that this blue land, like other blue areas we've looked at, through some economy with the truth about the relationship about lands and tithes, was enclosed for the first time even after the dissolution. Bertree may have become a separate farmstead at some later point in, say, the 17th century. The earliest documentary evidence of a residence here appears to be the will of a Thomas Law of Bertree, a will that dates from 1698. Let's press on now with our search for the boundary of the Grange described in the charters. From a point close to the tarn, from close to Ascot Dub, if not from the Dub itself, that boundary goes, and the translated words of the charter are here in the text box, thence to the boundary of land belonging to the hospital, and by that boundary unto Skers, and thence as far as the arable land of Aspey extends on that side towards T-Bay. Note that reference to hospital in the second line. A hospital which appears to have held land in Aspey at this period was an institution in York, definitely in existence by the later 11th century, known first as St. Peter's and then from the 13th century as St. Leonard's. This great hospital at York, run by Canons Regular of St. Augustine, housed more staff and inmates than any other English medieval hospital. This religious order did not undertake direct management of their lands like the Cistercians. Their focus was on pastoral care. So St. Leonard's land in Aspey would probably have been held as a source of rental income, not as a grange like Byland's estate. Unfortunately, most records for the Westmoreland estates of St. Leonard's have been lost, but there is one document that can shed some light. This is a translation and transcription of a single undated document published in one of the volumes of the Royal Commission on Historical Documents. It is a demise of land by Robert, son of Coleman, to the Hospital of St. Peter at York. The second line of this translation notes the 8 scores of land that the hospital held in Abbey or Abbey. And here we're looking at a second document and struggling to read it. This one, translated and transcribed in his own very difficult to read handwriting by John Hill, 19th century Lord of the Manor of Abbey Winderwath, is included in 7 volumes of his personal papers held at the archives in Carlisle. The original document, translated by Hill, dates from 1341, by which time St. Peter's had become St. Leonard's. It contains evidence, if Hill's translation is correct. Don't struggle to read it, I've included it here simply because of its direct link to Hill. It contains evidence, towards the end of the final line, that the same Hospital of St. Leonard also held at least some part of a group of fields called Haber in Abbey. This 1341 document, as I say, translated by Hill, records a transfer of land, 2 acres on Haber, from St. Leonard's to a Robert de Askerby. Perhaps this was at a time when the hospital was getting out of its lands in Abbey. Just for a moment or two, we'll jump to the north along what I believe was the boundary of the monastic estate, to try to find where fields with this element Haber in their names can be found. And you can see there's a scattering of these fields arcing across the middle of the screen. You can see that they're also located quite close to the place where we began our journey, marked by that green star and arrow, lower centre right. And there is Maisongill, towards bottom right, the boundary gill. We'll come back here in a few minutes. As you can see here, the name Haber probably derives from an Old English or an Old Norse word meaning hay, and that word has been combined with either the Old English bjorg, meaning hill or mound, or the Old Norse berg, which can mean hill or mountain. Therefore, this place is probably a hill where hay is grown, meadowland in other words. And today many of these south-facing slopes are silage fields. Dixon's Haber has a red manorial boundary line around it because it was once a detached part of the manor and township of Abbey Coatsford. These Haber fields are within what was almost certainly a large block of meadow and arable land leased to St. Peter's, later St. Leonard's, Hospital. Now that we've established where the hospital lands may have been and where our boundary may be heading, let's go back to the Tarn, to Ascot Dub, and remind ourselves of those translated words of the Charter. Here they are. Thence to the boundary of that land belonging to the hospital, and by that boundary unto Skers, and thence as far as the arable land of Abbey extends on that side towards T-Bay. My best interpretation is that the boundary followed a line which is more or less that taken by a present-day dry stone wall. The first section of that is coloured yellow on the screen. It's just left of the text box, going in the direction of the hospital land and the Habers that we've just looked at. Further along, by, the Charter says, at the beginning of line 3 in the text box, and that word by probably means in the vicinity of the boundary of that hospital land. The boundary of our Grange land reaches the Skers, a limestone outcrop or scar. In general terms, this limestone outcrop is probably the same Skers referred to in the words used at the beginning of the Charter, as Maisongill goes down from the skers. Perhaps that word skers refers here to this line of limestone outcrop, marked here as an irregular yellow shape just left of centre. As you can see, it is just above Maisongill. On the ground it looks like this. You can see one part of the limestone outcrop in the middle distance. The trees beyond it, on the skyline to the right of the screen, to the right of the image, are growing in Maisongill, the starting point of our journey. Now, just another quick glance at those closing words of the Charter. At a number of points along my speculated line of the boundary, remember that's the continuous yellow line following the present-day dry stone wall, there are large stones incorporated into the wall footings, like they were near the house or possible burial cairns that we looked at a little while ago. As I said then, stones like these may once have been boundary markers or part of the structure of a more substantial boundary delineating the limits of the land granted to Byland, or even vestiges of an ancient boundary that predates the period of the Byland Grange, but which may have been reused to demarcate the Grange lands. Here, further towards the western end of my suggested boundary line, the yellow line remember, there appears to be evidence of a ditch and bank that may once have marked this stretch of the boundary. I've marked those features in this photograph. The line of the stone-faced bank is on the left, with a more recent wall built upon it. The line of the ditch, running parallel with it, is on the right. In this photograph, we've moved just a little further west of that ditch and bank that we looked at, and we're looking north, down into Maisongill itself. In the left foreground, and running towards the trees, there appears to be a relict wall. It's possible to trace this wall to the end of the gill, where it appears to link to another relict wall, running along the eastern boundary of a field with the curious lost name of Elfermire. And these relict walls may mark the part of the boundary of the Grangelands. Here we can see the line of that other relict wall on the eastern side of Elfermire. The tongue-like shape of that field is delineated here by old manor boundaries shown in red. The line of this relict wall goes towards, if you remember the Charter's words, that howe of stones on the lower side of Laithgrim. You've probably already recognised where we are, and recognise these names from the start of our journey. We have completed our circuit of the boundary of the Grange. The final words of the Charter of 1160 to 1170, describing where we are, say of the boundary that it goes, and I'll read from it, thence as far as the arable land of Abbey extends on that side towards Bay. The field name, Far Rains, you can see that at lower centre, in yellow font, may be a further clue to this place being the location described by those closing words. That's because this field name, Far Rains, is derived from the Old Norse word Rein, which meant a boundary strip, but it came to be used to describe a strip of unploughed land left standing as a boundary between holdings in a common arable field. So that field name, Far Rains, may mark the furthest extent of the arable land of Abbey on this side towards Bay, to borrow again the words of the Charter. Thus our journey ends. We hope you've enjoyed this flight through the story of part of the historic landscape of Abbey Parish, telling of its links to the Cistercians of Byland. We hope too that this flight may have helped you to understand a little more of the earth beneath, and that, as you continue to walk these fields and fells, you will remember all the people who have worked, shaped, and named this landscape. Thank you very much for watching. We look forward to you joining future flights to hear more about the historic landscape of Abbey Parish, just one of a myriad, many-layered corners of the Westmoreland Dales.
Recollit memoria passionis meus, mens impetus